3:12 January 1935. A grey light smeared the panes of the workshop at the Polish arsenal in Warsaw. The place smelled of cutting oil and cold brass, lathe shavings, lens dust, the thin sour of gun oil. In a corner beneath a glass canopy, Rudolf Gundlach worked as if the night belonged to him. Gundlach's hands were stained with grease and abrasive powder, fingertips nicked from filing brass collars. He moved between a bench-top lathe and an optician's arbor, adjusting a prism mount with the micrometer, checking an eyepiece for centration. The machinery breathed. Motor hum at 1500 RPM, a faint vibration running along the bench like a second pulse. Major Stanislaw Kurek stood by the door in a uniform that had seen parades and poor ammunition supplies. His boots made a hard click on the concrete. He watched the contraption, a clumsy stack of tubes, gears, and a rotating prism, with the ironic patience of a man who had seen costly ideas die in training grounds. "Gundlach," the major said, voice flat as a report. "Tanks need armor, not optical luxuries. A hull that doesn't crack at 37 mm is what wins battles, not a periscope with a fancy prism." His words were measured. The emphasis fell like an order. The engineer did not look up. He fitted a cylindrical gear, a small bevel with a 48-12 ratio, into the periscope's transverse assembly and felt the teeth mesh. The mechanism would allow 36 degrees of rotation with a single hand. "Vision is not luxury, Major," Gundlach answered quietly. "Force without sight is an act of blind courage." He spoke as one who had studied angles on paper, focal lengths, field of view, parallax error reduced to the millimeter. On a scrap of paper lay the formulae: effective focal length, exit pupil diameter, required magnification to identify a target at 500 meters. His pencil had drawn curves where others would draw battle lines. For the first test, he rotated the prism. The image that came through was still rough, a ghost through crown glass and BK7 elements imperfectly coated. But the sweep, a full peripheral view without the turn of a head, was a revelation. Gundlach's mouth twitched in the half-smile of a man who had seen, for the first time, what a turret could do when it did not have to expose its eyes. Kurek snorted, but there was a new calculation under the contempt in his face. He peered into the eyepiece. Crosshairs, a distorted skyline beyond the arsenal's courtyard, and for an instant the major's practical face betrayed something like interest. "You claim we can sight without exposing a head?" he asked. Gundlach set his palm flat on the bench, feeling the small heat of the motor. "A rotating periscope, Major. Traverse gear, reduction ratio to smooth aiming, an internal mirror train. A man stays sealed in the cupola. The periscope takes the risk. A man points. The machine sees." He said it with the authority of an engineer who had counted every tooth, every line of sight. The workshop filled with small sounds, the click of a detent, the whisper of a polishing wheel, the tiny cough of the drill shifting speed. Outside, the arsenal's gates opened and closed like lungs. In the air sat the knowledge that war might come, a low, mechanical inevitability that vibrated in the stringing of the lights. Kurek's answer was blunt. "In battle there is no time for fine optics. A shell travels at 300 meters per second. You want men to calibrate lenses while shells arrive?" He tapped a Farnsworth flare chart on the table, as if to puncture the notion with data. Gundlach's eyes, behind thick spectacles, were tired but steady. "Major, the tank is a fortress that kills blind. If we grant it eyes that do not expose their owner, we reduce casualties. Identification at range, avoid friendly fire, avoid mistaken angles. That's a kind of preservation. It is mechanical mercy." Silence fell between them like snowfall. The radiator hissed softly. For a moment the two men, one military and one maker, measured the distance between conviction and necessity. The room smelled of turpentine and iron and a small, stubborn hope. When the image cleared an inch more, sharper contrast from a recoated prism, an adjustment of the azimuth control, Gundlach looked toward the Major. "Look," he said simply. The engineer was not yet a prophet. He was a man with a drawing, a material, a claim. See without moving. The Major laughed then, a short, dismissive sound. "Eyes too many make fear, Gundlach," he said. The words were meant to close the debate, but the periscope had already begun to do what a calculation cannot. It had opened a new way to read the ground. The true front line for Gundlach was no longer outside on the dust and gravel. It was inside his chest, the battle between invention and the world that will use it. Night after night, the workshop at the Warsaw Arsenal kept a single light burning. Rudolf Gundlach bent over a lathe whose spindle sang at 1,200 RPM, the motor's harmonic vibration running up through his palms. Around him lay brass collars, BK7 glass blanks, and a stack of prism mounts thumb-scored with pencil notes. He worked with the smell of oil and emery in his nose, Esmeril wheel grinding glass under a thin ligament of water to keep heat down. The polishing wheel whispered like scripture as he brought crown glass to a tolerance measured in microns. Each pass shaved a whisper from failure. The periscope was a skeleton of gears and tubes, bevel gears meshing at a 4812 reduction, a traverse assembly milled from solid steel, a detent click to hold factory azimuth. Gundlach fitted a worm gear and felt the teeth engage, testing backlash with the micrometer's delicate pressure. His notes were geometry, effective focal length, exit pupil diameter, required magnification for target ID at 500 meters, calculations for parallax error eliminated by the rotating prism. He drew arcs and wrote numbers in cramped German script, the draftsman's hand of an engineer who measured possibility. Sometimes he slept on a stool with a rag under his head, waking to check the prism train again. The transformer hummed at 50 hertz. The bench lamp kept a ring of heat on his cheek. He felt the fatigue in his forearms like a physical language, lead bones, steady hands. There was danger in precision. One slip at the polishing wheel would introduce a stress fracture. One mislap of the prism coating would flare at daybreak and ruin the field. Gundlach measured each breath against the spin of the lathe and the sweep of the grinding stone. Major Stanislaw Kurek came less often than duty required, but when he came he wore the impatience of a man responsible for steel and men. He tapped his boot on the concrete and asked for reports in a tone that expected brevity. "How long until it sees true?" he demanded. Gundlach answered with specifics. "Rework the internal mirror train, reduce coma by 2 minutes of arc, then the sweep will be clean. Adjust the anti-reflective coating to 0.2% loss across the visible band." He did not pitch wonder, he listed tolerances. The Major traded glance for data. They tested the assembly under the glass canopy with a makeshift range beyond the arsenal courtyard. Barrels, a mock horizon painted on a wooden screen, a battered target at 400 meters. Gundlach rotated the prism slowly, and the room held its breath as the image swept. For the first time, the field cleared, a continuous peripheral view without turning ahead. The eyepiece's exit pupil delivered a bright, sharp plane, crosshairs superimposed on the skyline. The bench fell into a silence that felt like a held footstep. Kurek's face changed. The irony smoothed out into a practical line of calculation. He peered into the eyepiece, fingers finding the traverse lever. "With this," he said low, almost to himself, "I can see the enemy where I choose. It makes sense to fight with that sight." The acceptance sounded like a report signed. The periscope's berth was almost clandestine, parts scavenged from training vehicles, borings stolen from a heavy shop, a coating procured through a contact at the optical lab. Men spoke in terse sentences and passed sketches under the hum of the nightlights. Pride and worry braided in whispered conference. Word travelled through the arsenal in a slow, taut way. A captain's nod, a clerk's folded paper, a sergeant's soft step in the corridor. Pride met fear. Engineers swelled at the promise. Officers counted calibers and time to target. Each man measured the device against the ledger of lives. Gundlach watched them all and felt a private weather. Triumph sat like a stone in his chest, a heavy and complicated heat. He had made a way to look without exposing the man. Yet, in the clink of gears, he also heard the distant promise of guns finding a new accuracy. The revolution had been made under pressure. The moral weight had just begun its descent. Explosions chewed the dawn into pieces. In September 1939, the arsenal in Warsaw became a map of smouldering roofs and collapsed brick. Blast waves rattled lathe motors and sent sparks from the grinding stones into the rain. Machines that had hummed at steady RPMs stopped mid-note, and a smell of burnt varnish and hot metal filled the yard. Rudolf Gundlach moved through that new geometry, like a man cataloguing a loss. His spectacles were split at the bridge, one lens spidered with glass. He wrapped the broken frame with a rag and thrust his precious notebook into a coat pocket. The cadenza of the workshop, lathes at 200 RPM, polishing wheels whispering, gave way to boots and shouted orders. Crates stenciled Obiect 360 rolled out onto muddy pallets as if from nowhere. Soldiers, grey coats and sure hands, yanked open wooden lids and found mirror trains, prism mounts, bevel gears and engraved traverse assemblies. The marking on the cases, once a private code in the blueprints, now read like a summons to appropriation. A Wehrmacht truck idled with its engine clattering, the diesel clack-clack of a last reliable pulse. Men in field caps stacked periscope housings and lens barrels into the flatbed. One corporal barked calibers and quantities over his shoulder. "Alle Teile packen! Optical sets, 2 dozen. Secure the prisms." The language was brisk, efficient. The taking was clinical. Gundlach listened as the music of his life, the click of detents, the smooth mesh of worm gears, was drowned by the drum and clatter of war. The lathe chatter became indistinct under the staccato of mortar fire. He could no longer hear the sweet scrape of glass on felt without thinking of falling masonry. An officer with a Wehrmacht field map pried open a crate and lifted a rotating prism assembly like a relic. He turned it in his gloved hands, admired the anti-reflective coating, felt the precise play in the 4812 bevel gearing that Gundlach had calculated for smooth traverse. "Ingenieurarbeit," he murmured, and Gundlach understood the word without need of translation. Polish technicians who had worked nights with Gundlach watched their prototypes disappear into the German columns. Faces that had measured focal lengths and adjusted azimuths now stood with soot on the cheeks, silent. A young machinist tried to block a crate and was pulled aside by a soldier who did not care for pleas. The workshop emptied as if everyone had been exhaled. Plans were photographed in hurried light by field engineers. Drawings, schematics of the worm drive, notes on exit pupil diameter and field of view, the sketches of the mirror train were copied with ink and held up to flash lamps. The data that had been a guarded advantage suddenly became raw material the aggressor could adapt. Gundlach shoved his notebook deeper into his coat. That battered volume of sketches and tests, reduction ratios, parallax calculations, sketches labeled Obiect 360, was the only thing he could carry out intact. He felt its weight like a heart. The rest of his work went away in the hands of others. "Stop!" he shouted once, ridiculous and small. A lieutenant glanced at him, uninterested. A sergeant barked, "Step back, Pole! This is requisition now!" The words fell like hammers. Gundlach's voice shrank against the diesel clatter and the distant roar of falling iron. Despite the chaos, enemy engineers worked with a surgeon's curiosity. They disassembled periscope housings, checked mirror alignments, measured the anti-reflection layers. They noted backlash tolerances in the traverse train, the chosen magnification for target ID at ranges beyond 400–600 meters, and the tolerances Gundlach had held to within microns. In the smoke and the smear of oil, Gundlach felt a physical hollowing. The bench became a place he could no longer command. Gears lay transient in foreign hands. His chest tightened as if the lathe itself had been removed from his ribs. He tasted iron and old glue and the shame of impotence. He fled that night on a freight train with windows blackened and with other refugees who clutched bundles and tin mugs. The locomotive's whistle screamed like an alarm for a life that had been unmoored. As Warsaw passed in a blurred corridor of firelight, Gundlach kept the notebook against his chest and watched the silhouettes of factories recede like diagrams erased. News carried the theft outward. German engineering bureaus reverse-engineered mirror trains. Workshops in far provinces spun worm gears to fit captured traverse housings. Later, as borders shifted and the Red Army pressed, copies proliferated again. The device had become a migratory technology, unbranded and unstoppable. Poland had lost more than machines that September. It had lost its eyes first. Gundlach felt the emptiness in the same place a man feels for a missing limb, a phantom of looking. He watched on newsprint and whisper as battlefields filled with anonymous periscopes, lenses that saw without the Polish signature, the inventor's name stripped from the angle of vision. The dream he had forged under lamps and polish now moved across Europe with no one to claim the gaze. The lecture hall at the vicar's works smelled of oil and solder. Fluorescent tubes buzzed above racks of prototype housings. Lieutenant William Carter stood by a wooden podium, palms on a stack of slides, and introduced the device with the easy authority of a man who had to sell conviction as much as metal. Across the room, behind a pane of glass meant for foreign visitors, Rudolf Gundlach watched in a borrowed coat, his breath fogging the window like a ghost trying to speak. Carter clicked a projector and a blueprint bloomed. The Vickers periscope, Maykay. Schematic lines tracing a rotating prism train, internal mirror mounts, a worm drive traverse with a bevel reduction to smooth aiming. Around the drawing, engineers murmured over notes: axial spacing, effective focal length, exit pupil diameter, terms Gundlach had measured in his own cramped script years earlier in Warsaw's lab. A full peripheral sweep without the commander emerging from the cupola, Carter said, voice carrying a mixture of pride and necessity. Traverse assembly uses a 48-12 reduction, detent indexing for quick azimuth locks, magnification selectable for target ID at 500 meters, keeps the men sealed and the eyes forward. The technical cadence filled the room like a firing order. Gundlach felt each syllable as if it were a rivet being driven through his chest. His spectacles lay in his pocket, spidered glass gone from the raid months before, and his fingers, stained with grind dust, fidgeted at the wool of his cuff. He listened as his native phrases became English descriptors, his invention rebadged and reborn in another tongue. The sound of his language evaporated inside the mouths across the table. Outside the soundproofed glass, the world moved in the way dreadful inventions do, through mud and metal. Sherman and Churchill tanks rolled toward the Normandy hedgerows, tracks chewing at churned earth, 75 milliliters and 6-pounder barrels rising and dipping with traffic. Periscope housings winked between rain and smoke, lenses catching the light like 1,000 small, indifferent eyes on the battlefield. In a dim cafe off Horse Ferry Road, a cluster of engineers argued into the small hours. They spoke of field curvature and coma, of anti-reflective coatings, magnesium fluoride layers, and of the merits of a prism train versus an optical relay. The MK reduces parallax at range, one said, stirring his coffee. and the exit pupil is wide enough for sustained observation without eye fatigue. None of them knew the name printed in the margins of the earliest drafts. "It's British engineering through and through," a young Vickers draftsman declared, tapping the table as if to puncture doubt. "We've adapted the housing to the Sherman cupola, sealed the optics against condensation, added a quick-release block for field repairs." The claim rode the cigarette smoke. The fact that the idea had crossed borders in crates and requisition orders did not trouble the certainty. A BBC bulletin swept through London that afternoon like a blade. "New vision for the Allies. Advantage in the eyes," the announcer intoned, the voice crisp and public-minded. The line was meant to comfort and to advertise. Technology as a kind of moral reassurance. Gundlach, waiting by a shop window, heard it in the reflected tin of passing buses and flinched. He mouthed the two words inwardly, "My eyes," until the syllables felt raw. The broadcast became a tally, bronze medals in the newsreels for visible bravery, invisible credits erased in the small, meticulous ink of his notebooks. Pride rose like heat in his chest, and beside it a bitter current, a recognition that utility and authorship had been uncoupled by war. In the Vickers workshops, the adaptation was efficient and unapologetic. Engineers rethreaded worm gears for faster response under turret vibration, respeced seals to resist thermal shock, added azimuth indexing to match Allied fire plans. Field manuals were revised to include periscope maintenance, lubricant types, backlash tolerances, hourly checks for mirror alignment, practices Gundlach had insisted on in Polish margins. The irony was mechanical and intimate. The same gear ratios that smoothed a sight also smoothed out a name. Each improvement, an anti-fogging bladder here, a reinforced housing there, magnified the device's reach and diluted the memory of its creator. Watching soldiers calibrate magnifications and mark target ranges, Gundlach felt a craftsman's satisfaction undercut by the sharp taste of erasure. Carter, in his neat uniform, moved through the room later and stopped at the glass where Gundlach lingered. He did not recognize the man whose eyes traced the slides. "You look like you know what you see," Carter said, offering a cigarette with a practical gait. He spoke with the blunt courtesy of a commander who measures worth by results and supply lines. Gundlach only smiled, small and distant. He responded in halting English, "It is not the same to see and to be seen for what you made." His words landed like a dropped nut on the workshop floor, simple, weighty. Carter's brow furrowed with a professional curiosity, not the language of ownership. "If it saves lives, mister," he began. "Gundlach," the exile finished, more forceful than he planned. "If it saves lives, then perhaps it is worth the anonymity." The cigarette between Carter's fingers burned down. Practicality and conscience rubbed against each other like gears under load. That night, Gundlach walked past a shop window and looked in. The glass divided his face. One pane caught the laboratory's light, another the neon of the street. In the fractured reflection, he saw the man who had drafted traverse ratios and the man who had watched his work move across flags and fronts without a signature. Pride and anonymity sat on his face like two shadows. As Allied tanks cut through the mud of Normandy and radio voices praised the new periscope's gift, Gundlach understood that invention had a life apart from its maker. The Vickers periscope Maquia IV would become a tool of survival and of war. The optics would grant commanders a far reach, and the inventor's name would be another casualty left in the margins of blueprints. He pressed his palm to the cool glass and watched the divided reflection look back, uncertain which half to trust. Dawn on the Normandy bocage smelled of diesel and wet earth. Hedgerows cut the light into slats and tanks moved like a low tide, treads churning the mud. In turret cups the periscopes winked, small glinting sentries, lifting the battlefield into a dozen measured planes of sight. Commanders spoke into throat mics, their voices carried back to England on crackling radio waves and folded into dispatches that landed on Gundlach's kitchen table like weather reports. Inside a modest flat, Rudolf Gundlach sat by a shortwave receiver, the dial tuned to a BBC bulletin relaying front messages. He was older now, his hair thin to silver, spectacles thick at the bridge. Beside him, Elżbieta kept the kettle warm and listened in the way people listen for both news and absolution. When the announcer cut to a field report, Gundlach's hands, stained with memory of grind dust, tightened around the rim of his cup. The report came in clipped, soldierly tones. A Sherman commander praising a new site, a Churchill crew manager noting how they could fix ranges without popping the hatch. For the first time, one voice said over static, "I can see the whole field without risking my life." The phrase travelled from turret to radio mast to Gundlach's cramped room and landed like a small stone in his chest. On the fields, the machines answered with a different language. Sherman M4s crawled forward on Continental R975 engines. Their 75mm M3 guns rose to crest hedgerows. Churchill M-Ketefis lumbered with heavy gear ratios, 6-pounder barrels peeking from glacis plates. Periscopes threaded their way through turrets, worm drives smoothing azimuth, detent indexing clicking like metronomes as commanders locked on targets. Maintenance routines had become rites. Crews checked anti-fogging bladders, wiped lenses with lens tissue, verified mirror train alignments against a small test chart. A sergeant barked checks on exit pupil and eye relief, make sure the commander could hold observation without eye fatigue. In the rain and mud, the periscope housings shed condensation with the efficiency of a machine meeting a problem it was designed to solve. Letters and reports arrived in bundles to communication offices. A dispatch from a lieutenant in the field described a sweeping periscope traverse. "We can now range infantry at 500 meters and hold fire until the target is confirmed." The words in the telegram were blunt and precise. Range tables, reference distances, and the quiet gratitude of men who had stayed sealed in their cups and lived to tell it. Gundlach listened to the praise and felt the name that should have been inked on those pages thinned out by distance. He ran his palm over the worn notebook he had carried from Warsaw, fingers tracing the cramped formulae. Effective focal length, parallax correction, the 48-12 bevel gearing that smoothed the traverse. The mathematics of survival that had once seemed abstract now read like invoice lines on a battlefield ledger. "Elżbieta," he murmured as if confessing to the kettle, "those are my eyes." Her hand found his on the tabletop. She did not look away. Her voice, when it came, was not angry. It was simple and steady. "They see because you taught them to see. That is not nothing." The sentence was a salve and a thorn both. Across the channel, a Sherman commander radioed in between the grind of tracks and the bark of M3 recoil. "Periscope gave me the sector sweep. No need to expose. Saved 2 men this morning." The comms log noted the time, the grid coordinates, and a terse commendation. The sighting apparatus had altered the calculus of command in one small, deadly way. Back in the maintenance pits, the technical minutiae mattered as much as valor. Calibration charts were adjusted. Remove 2 minutes of arc to correct for turret sag. Recoat prism surfaces with magnesium fluoride to cut reflective losses. Test backlash tolerance in the worm gear under simulated turret vibration. Each tweak tightened the periscope's promise: accurate vision at speed, at distance, under fire. Gundlach understood the language of those adjustments intimately. He had counted backlash in microns, set mirror spacing to reduce coma, balanced the exit pupil to reduce eye strain over prolonged surveillance. Those were small mercies for men who had to make split decisions in the churn of engines and the scream of ordnance. Yet the applause that rode back over radio channels never spoke his name. The periscopes in Sherman's and Churchill's had become tools bearing the anonymity of instruments. Commanders claimed utility, factories claimed adaptation. Newspapers lauded the improvement without tracing the delicate thread back to a Polish bench under glass and lamplight. One evening, a voice on the wireless read a line from a commander in Caen. "The field unfolds like a map across the cupola, no need to risk the head." Gundlach folded the paper report and set it beside his notebook. Pride and bitterness braided inside him. Pride that a craft he loved spared lives. Bitterness that the craft's ledger omitted the hand that had drawn it. Outside, tanks rolled on. The periscope's glass caught the hedgerow light and refracted it into 1,000 small decisions. When to open fire, whom to spare, where to take cover. In those millisecond choices, the machine granted commanders vision that belonged to all the crew and to none. The battlefield's moral calculus had shifted in mechanical degrees. Elżbieta watched him measure his breaths, saw the man who had given an army sight become a shadow behind his own invention. She touched his lined cheek and said quietly, "You built a tool that kept men alive. That cannot be only theft." Her words steadied him, though they did not erase the ache. Gundlach rose then and went to the window. Across rooftops he watched smoke trace the horizon like a map of suffering, and in his palm the notebook felt like a talisman. The reports on the radio praised a technology that blurred the line between salvation and anonymity. He pressed his forehead to the glass, and for a long moment let the periscope's far reach be both his triumph and his loss. Dawn had a different weight in London than it did in Warsaw. On this morning of 1945, the city moved in parades and whistles, while inside a small flat tucked off a rain-slick street, Rudolf Gundlach sat alone at a workbench. The rumble of tracks, Sherman M4s and a few Churchill Maikaifis, filtered through the window like distant thunder, a mechanical hymn to an ambiguous victory. He wrote the sentence slowly, hands still from a lifetime of tool use. "I did not create a weapon. I created a chance." The ink sat raw on the page. A private ledger in a notebook still creased from his flight out of Poland. The line was both confession and prescription. On the bench, the periscope lay partly disassembled, an aluminum housing with paint chipped from field use, a mirror train removed and set on a felt pad, a BK7 prism with an anti-reflective magnesium fluoride coating that, where flaked, showed thin spider webs of abrasion. A worm drive and bevel pair, 48-12 reduction, waited like small mechanical lungs, their teeth clean and precise amid the scattered tools. A cracked objective lens caught the room's light and refracted it into a broken face. In that half-light, Gundlach saw himself split. One side the man of meticulous tolerances, the other the exile whose name had not travelled with the optics. The reflection was a small cruelty, an accurate mirror of pride and erasure. Elżbieta, hair-pinned, came and laid her hand on his shoulder with the quiet authority of years. "It's over," she said, but her voice carried both relief and a measured sorrow. He did not answer immediately. His throat worked with a sound she could not misread. Outside the windows, the city celebrated with a soundscape of clanking metal and shouted slogans. A wireless set on the sideboard sent voices through the flat. BBC bulletins, a field report from Normandy, a commentator praising improved observation tools that had given commanders a new advantage. The words landed in Gundlach's room like small, polite knives. He traced a finger along notes he had once made. Effective focal length, exit pupil diameter, required magnification for target identification at 500 meters, the correction tables for parallax, and the technical facts read like a map of intent. The periscope's utility was a chain of precise tolerances, eye relief measured in millimeters, mirror spacing set to reduce coma, backlash tolerances calculated for turret vibration. Those margins were not theoretical to him, they were memory. He could still hear the lathe at 1,200 RPM, the Esmeril wheel's high wail, as he ground crown glass to micron tolerances, the polishing wheel's whisper as he reduced surface roughness. His body remembered the work. Forearms burned with short, honest fatigue, fingers with the small, permanent calluses of a man who had filed truth into metal. Pride rose and curdled into something like guilt. He had built a way to see, to keep a head sealed under armor, and let glass do the risking. Men had survived because a lens could deliver the information a commander needed. But that survival came in the context of ordnance, 75mm and 6-pounder guns now aimed by eyes he had helped make possible. Elżbieta watched him, patient, and said what love always says when invention and casualty sit at the same table. "Your hands made sight," she told him softly. "Names are for paperwork. What you built kept men in their texture of life." He let the sentence rest in that soft space between them. Gundlach lifted the cracked prism and turned it in the light. Where the MGF-2 coating had flaked the surface, showed micro-pitting from shrapnel grit and the stress lines of field service. He murmured the specs as if invoking them. Detent indexing holds azimuth. Worm gear reduction smooths the traverse. Keep backlash below 5 arc minutes. These were the small enchantments that let a periscope give a commander a slow, steady eye. The papers that afternoon were full of photos, columns of tanks on Whitehall, commanders shaking hands, crowds cheering. The captions called it triumph. The image captions failed to mention the anonymous optics engineers in workshops or the Polish bench where the first rotating prism had been coaxed into clean sweep. Gundlach felt the erasure like a bruise. He thought of the men who had trained under him at the arsenal, lathe operators and opticians whose hands knew the exact hardness of polishing compound, whose eyes could read a reticle at 50 yards. Some had been taken, some had vanished into factories now under foreign flags. Their craftsmanship persisted in metal that bore no signature. On his table, the periscope's housing caught the wan, cold light, and Gundlach understood the paradox. Tools can save, and tools can be used to strike. The moral arithmetic didn't simplify into slogans. It lived instead in tiny choices. How wide an exit pupil to allow so a tired eye would not fail. How much magnification to permit before image stabilization failed under recoil. He made another note in the notebook, and the pen scraped like a lathe's tool. "Seeing is not victory," he wrote, then paused and underlined it once. Outside, the parade rolled on. Inside, with the smell of oil and the quiet authority of a broken lens, Rudolf Gundlach folded the notebook closed, feeling the true legacy like a weight on his palm. A chance given, a name lost, and the knowledge that some inventions ask more of their maker than the world will ever repay. The Imperial War Museum hummed with the soft, patient noise of tourism. Footsteps on polished concrete, the whisper of audio guides, the distant roll of a school group's laughter. Under the gallery lights, behind a strip of museum glass, the periscope sat like a small, stubborn artifact. A satin-finished aluminum housing scored by field service, a worm drive exposed at one end, beveled teeth still clean where oil had been kept honest. Visitors leaned forward, faces close to the glass. A boy of 8 pointed and asked his father in a bright, unguarded voice, "Who made that?" The question landed on the guide like a pebble on a quiet pond. He shuffled a sheet of notes, his practiced smile in place, then hesitated over a name that felt like an aside. It's often listed as the Vickers periscope, credited to wartime adaptations. There's a Polish engineer sometimes mentioned, Rudolf Gundlach. The syllables were small in the open air. Some in the group murmured. The guide moved on quickly. Dates, model numbers, the periscope's role in tactical doctrine, because museum tours run by cadence, not by confession. The boy's finger stayed pointed, insisting on a lineage the labels had smoothed away. On the placard beneath the glass, the description was careful and efficient. Vickers periscope Mikera 4, rotating prism train, anti-reflective MGF2 coatings, detent indexing for rapid azimuth locks, adapted for Sherman and Churchill cupolas. There was no flourish about stolen crates or exiled notebooks, only the neutral language of specifications and service life. The periscope's mirror train lay partly visible, a row of BK7 and crown glass elements with residues of anti-fogging compound in the seams. A conservator's card listed maintenance specifics in a neat block of type. Periodic inspection of backlash tolerances in the worm drive, lubrication with light-grade oil to 40 SAE, checks for mirror alignment down to arc-minute tolerances. The technical detail read like a prayer to durability. An old man lingered at the edge of the crowd, fingers curled in the pocket of a coat that had once smelled of oil and metal. He watched the small gears and the sighting reticle through the glass with an expression that mixed recognition and distance. If anyone asked, he would have said he saw 1,000 decisions refracted through that little tube, choices about when to open fire, when to hold, which had been made by men under crush and recoil. The museum smelled faintly of polish and paper, but under that was the ghost of machine rooms, the hawk-low rumble of Continental R975 engines, the tired diesel cough of tracked carriers idling before a push. Those were the sounds the periscope had known. Engines at 2,400 RPM under load, turrets cranking to a commanded azimuth, and here they were flattened into museum quiet. A young mechanic in the group squinted at the exposed worm gear and said to her companion, "Look, 48.12 reduction. See how the bevel meshes. That explains the smoothing under-turret vibration." She touched the glass absently, as if she could feel the backlash tolerances through the museum barrier. Others nodded. The object resumed its life as an engineering lesson. The guide, now walking the route, recited the periscope's tactical history, reduced parallax error, increased identification range, target ID at 500 meters became feasible without commander exposure, and how those margins of vision translated into fewer exposed heads, and therefore fewer casualties. The crowd listened to the arithmetic of life and death in the same breath. But between the technicalities and the anecdote, the old man mouthed a line under his breath like a benediction. He had scribbled it once in a notebook pressed to his chest years ago. "I did not create a weapon. I created a chance." The phrase had held then, and still held now, not an argument to be made in a museum, but a private ledger to be weighed. A child pressed his face to the glass and saw his reflection superimposed on the sighting reticle, a double image of curiosity and inheritance. The boy's father named calibers for him, 75mm M3s, 6-pounders in the older Churchills, and the child repeated the numbers like a new kind of alphabet. The periscope, for him, became magic and math in the same glance. Somewhere in the room, a conservator adjusted the light level to protect the anti-reflective coatings. "Magnesium fluoride layers are thin," he explained to a colleague, "vulnerable to abrasion and to UV." The conservator's hands moved with the cautious certainty of someone who knows the difference between preservation and erasure. The crowd thinned, and the old man stayed, shoulders slightly bowed, the notebook under his arm now a folded thing of memory. He pressed his palm to the glass for a breath, and then drew it back. The periscope's polished rim reflected the overhead bulbs and the shadow of his hand, an image of contact mediated by a pane meant to separate touch from artifact. On the way out, the father asked his son what he'd take from the visit. "That people make the things that see," the boy declared with grave simplicity. The father smiled, pleased at the moral clarity of a small mind. The museum swallowed them both, the periscope glinting behind glass as if to confirm that vision had a price, but not always an author. As the last visitors passed, a speaker in the ceiling murmured the phrase that no plaque could bear alone: "Seeing is not victory." But who sees first? Who arranges the lenses, numbers the bevels, measures the exit pupil, chooses in a subtle geometry what survives? The periscope remained behind its glass, an eye that people walked around and that, in reflections and histories, caught them looking back.